Hey, Keith.
3. The wart slept well in the woodland nest where he had laid himself down, in that kind of thin but refreshing sleep which people have when they first lie out of doors. At first he only dipped below the surface of sleep, and skimmed along like a salmon in shallow water, so close to the surface that he fancied himself in the air. He thought himself awake when he was already asleep. He saw the stars above his face, whirling round on their silent and sleepless axis, and the leaves of the trees rustling against them, and heard small changes in the grass. These little noises of footsteps, and soft fringed wing beats, and stealthy bellies drawn over the grass blades, or rattling against the bracken, at first frightened or interested him, so that he moved to see what they were, but never saw, then soothed him, so that he no longer cared to see what they were, but trusted them to be themselves, and finally left him altogether as he swam down deeper and deeper, nuzzling his nose into the scented turf, into the warm ground, into the unending waters under the earth. It had been difficult to go to sleep in the bright summer moonlight, but once he was there it was not difficult to stay. The sun came early, causing him to turn over in protest, but in going to sleep he had learned to vanquish light, and now the light could not rewake him. It was 9 o'clock, 5 hours after daylight, before he rolled over, opened his eyes, and was awake at once. He was hungry. The ward had heard about people who lived on berries, but this did not seem practical at the moment because it was July and there were none. He found 2 wild strawberries and ate them greedily. They tasted nicer than anything, so he wished there were more. Then he wished it was April, so that he could find some birds' eggs and eat those, or that he had not lost his goshawk, Collie, so that the bird could catch him a rabbit, which he could cook by rubbing 2 sticks together like the base Indian. But he had lost Collie, or he would not have lost himself, and probably the sticks would not have lighted in any case. He decided that he could not have gone more than 3 or 4 miles from home, so the best thing he could do would be to sit still and listen. Then he might hear the noise of the haymakers, if he was lucky with the wind, and could hearken his way home by that. What he did hear was a faint clanking noise, which made him think that King Pellinore must be after the questing beast again, close by. Only the noise was so regular and single in intention that it made him think of King Pellinore doing some special action with great patience and concentration, trying to scratch his back without taking off his armor, for instance. He went towards the noise. There was a clearing in the forest, and in this clearing there was a snug little cottage built of stone. It was a cottage, although the wart could not notice this at the time, which was divided into 2 bits. The main bit was the hall, or every-purpose room, which was high because it extended from floor to roof, and this room had a fire on the floor whose smoke issued eventually out of a hole in the thatch of the roof. The other half of the cottage was divided into 2 rooms by a horizontal floor, which made the top half into a bedroom and study, while the bottom half served for a larder, storeroom, stable, and barn. A white donkey lived in this downstairs room, and a ladder led to the one upstairs. There was a well in front of the cottage, and the metallic noise which the wart had heard was caused by a very old gentleman who was drawing water out of it by means of a handle and chain. Clank, 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 said the chain, until the bucket hit the lip of the well, and "Oh, drat the whole thing," said the old gentleman. "You would think after all these years of study one could do better for oneself than a buy Our Lady well with a buy Our Lady bucket, whatever the buy Our Lady cost. I wish to goodness," added the old gentleman, heaving his bucket out of the well with a malevolent glance, that I was only on the electric light and accompanies water. Drat it! The old gentleman that the wart saw was a singular spectacle. He was dressed in a flowing gown with fur tippets, which had the signs of the zodiac embroidered all over it, together with various cabalistic signs, as of triangles with eyes in them, queer crosses, leaves of trees, bones and birds and animals, and a planetarium whose stars shone like bits of looking glass with the sun on them. He had a pointed hat like a dunce's cap, or like the headgear worn by ladies of that time, except that the ladies were accustomed to have a bit of veil floating from the top of it. He also had a wand of lignum vitae, which he had laid down in the grass beside him, and a pair of horn-rimmed spectacles like those of King Pellinore. They were extraordinary spectacles, being without earpieces, but shaped rather like scissors, or the antenna of the tarantula wasp. "Excuse me, sir," said the wart, "but can you tell me the way to Sir Ector's castle, if you don't mind?" The aged gentleman put down his bucket and looked at the wart. "Your name would be Wart," he said. "Yes, sir. Please, sir," said the wart. "My name," said the aged gentleman, "is Merlin." "How do you do?" said the wart. "How do you do?" said Merlin. "It is clement weather, is it not?" "It is," said the wart, "for the time of the year." When these formalities had been concluded, the wart had leisure to examine his new acquaintance more closely. The aged gentleman was staring at him with a kind of unwinking and benevolent curiosity, which made him feel that it would not be at all rude to stare back, no ruder than it would be to stare at one of his guardian's cows, who happened to be ruminating his personality as she leaned her head over a gate. Merlin had a long white beard and a long white mustache which hung down on either side of it, and close inspection shewed that he was far from clean. It was not that he had dirty fingernails or anything like that, but some large bird seemed to have been nesting in his hair. The wart was familiar with the nests of sparhawk and gosse, those crazy conglomerations of sticks and oddments which had been taken over from squirrels and crows, and he knew how the twigs and the tree foot were splashed with white mutes, old bones, muddy feathers, and castings. This was the impression which he gathered from Merlin. The old gentleman was streaked with droppings over his shoulders, among the stars and triangles of his gown, and a large spider was slowly lowering itself from the tip of his hat, as he gazed and slowly blinked at the little boy in front of him. He had a faintly worried expression, as though he were trying to remember some name which began with Chol, but which was pronounced in quite a different way, possibly Menzies, or was it Dalziel? His mild blue eyes, very big and round under the tarantula spectacles, gradually filmed and clouded over as he gazed at the boy, and then he turned his head away with a resigned expression, as though it was all too much for him after all. "Do you like peaches?" asked the old gentleman. "Very much indeed," answered the wart, and his mouth began to water so that it was full of sweet, soft liquid. "It is only July, you know," said the old man reprovingly, and walked off in the direction of the cottage without looking round. The wart followed him, since this was the simplest thing to do, and offered to carry the bucket, which seemed to please the old gentleman, who gave it to him, and waited while he counted his keys, and muttered and mislaid them, and dropped them in the grass. Finally, when they had got their way into the black and white cottage with as much trouble as if they were burglaring it, He climbed up the ladder after his host and found himself in the upstairs room. It was the most marvelous room that the wart had ever been in. There was a real corken drill hanging from the rafters, very lifelike and horrible, with glass eyes and scaly tail stretched out behind it. When its master came into the room, it winked one eye in salutation, although it was stuffed. There were hundreds of thousands of brown books in leather bindings, some chained to the bookshelves, and others propped up against each other, as if they had had too much spirits to drink and did not really trust themselves. These gave out a smell of must and solid brownness, which was most secure. Then there were stuffed birds, popinjays, and maggot pies, and kingfishers, and peacocks, with all their feathers but two, and tiny birds like beetles, and a reputed phoenix, which smelt of incense and cinnamon. It could not have been a real phoenix, because there's only one of these at a time. Over the mantelpiece there was a fox's mask, with Grafton, Uckingham to Daventry, 2 hours 20 mins written under it, and also a 40-pound salmon with aw 43 min bulldog written under it, and a very lifelike basilisk with Crowhurst otter hounds in Roman print. There were several boars' tusks and the claws of tigers and leopards mounted in symmetrical patterns, and a big head of Ovis poli, 6 live grass snakes in a kind of aquarium, some nests of the solitary wasp nicely set up in a glass cylinder, an ordinary beehive whose inhabitants went in and out of the window unmolested, 2 young hedgehogs in cotton wool, a pair of badgers which immediately began to cry yick, 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 in loud voices as soon as the magician appeared, 20 boxes which contained stick caterpillars, and 6 of the puss moth, and even an oleander that was worth 2 and 6, all feeding on the appropriate leaves, a gun case with all sorts of weapons which would not be invented for 500 years, a Rob box ditto, a lovely chest of drawers full of salmon flies which had been tied by Merlin himself, another chest whose drawers were labeled Mandragora, Mandrake, Old Man's Beard, etc., a bunch of turkey feathers and goose quills for making pins, an astrolabe, 12 pairs of boots, a dozen purse nets, 3 dozen rabbit wires, 12 corkscrews, an ant's nest between 2 glass plates, ink bottles of every possible color from red to violet, darning needles, a gold medal for being the best scholar at Eton, 4 or 5 recorders, a nest of field mice, all alive-o, 2 skulls, plenty of cut glass, Venetian glass, Bristol glass, and a bottle of mastic varnish, some Satsuma china, and some cloisonne. The 14th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, marred as it was by the sensationalism of the popular plates, 2 paint boxes, 1 oil, 1 watercolor, 3 globes of the known geographical world, a few fossils, the stuffed head of a camel leopard, 6 pismires, some glass retorts with cauldrons, Bunsen burners, etc., and the complete set of cigarette cards depicting wild fowl by Peter Scott. Merlin took off his pointed hat when he came into this extraordinary chamber, because it was too high for the roof, and immediately there was a little scamper in one of the dark corners, and a flap of soft wings, and a young tawny owl was sitting on the black skull-cap which protected the top of his head. "Oh, what a lovely owl!" cried the wart. But when he went up to it and held out his hand, the owl grew half as tall again, stood up as stiff as a poker, closed its eyes so that there was only the smallest slit to peep through, as one is in the habit of doing when told to shut one's eyes at hide and seek, and said in a doubtful voice, "There is no owl." Then it shut its eyes entirely and looked the other way. "It's only a boy," said Merlin. "There is no boy," said the owl hopefully, without turning round. The ward was so startled by finding that the owl could talk that he forgot his manners and came closer still. At this the owl became so nervous that it made a mess on Merlin's head. The whole room was quite white with droppings, and flew off to perch on the farthest tip of the Corkandrill's tail, out of reach. "We see so little company," explained Merlin, wiping his head with half a worn-out pair of pajama tops, which he kept for that purpose, "that Archimedes is a little shy of strangers. Come, Archimedes, I want you to meet a friend of mine called Wart." Here he held out his hand to the owl, who came waddling like a goose along the Corkandrill's back. He waddled with this rolling gait so as to keep his tail from being damaged, and hopped down onto Merlin's finger with every sign of reluctance. "Hold out your finger," said Merlin, "and put it behind his legs. No, lift it up under his train." When the wart had done this, Merlin moved the owl gently backwards so that the wart's finger pressed against its legs from behind, and it either had to step back on the finger or get pushed off its balance altogether. It stepped back. The wart stood there delighted, while the furry little feet held tight onto his finger, and the sharp claws prickled his skin. "Say, how do you do properly?" said Merlin. "I won't," said Archimedes, looking the other way and holding very tight. "Oh, he is lovely," said the wart again. "Have you had him very long?" "Archimedes has stayed with me since he was quite small. Indeed, since he had a tiny head like a chicken's." "I wish he would talk to me," said the wart. "Perhaps if you were to give him this mouse here politely, he might learn to know you better." Merlin took the dead mouse out of his skullcap. "I always keep them there," he explained, "and worms too, for fishing. I find it most convenient," and handed it to the wart, who held it out rather gingerly towards Archimedes. The nutty little curved beak looked as if it were capable of doing damage, but Archimedes looked closely at the mouse, blinked at the wart, moved nearer on the finger, closed his eyes, and leaned forward. He stood there with closed eyes and an expression of rapture on his face, as if he were saying grace, and then, with the absurdest, littlest sideways nibble, took the morsel so gently that he would not have broken a soap bubble. He remained leaning forward with closed eyes, with the mouse suspended from his beak, as if he were not sure what to do with it. Then he lifted his right foot, he was right-handed, and took hold of the mouse. He held it up like a boy holding a stick of rock, or a constable with his truncheon, looked at it, nibbled its tail. He turned it round so that it was head first, for the wart had offered it the wrong way round, and gave one gulp. He looked round at the company with the tail hanging out of the corner of his mouth, as much as to say, "I wish you would not all stare at me so," turned his head away, politely swallowed the tail, scratched his sailor's beard with his left toe, and began to ruffle out his feathers. "Let him alone," said Merlin, "now, for perhaps he does not want to be friends with you until he knows what you are like. With owls, it is never easy come and easy go." "Perhaps he will sit on my shoulder," said the wart, and with that he instinctively lowered his hand, so that the owl, who liked to be as high as possible, ran up the slope and stood shyly beside his ear. "Now, breakfast," said Merlin. The wart saw that the most perfect breakfast was laid out neatly for two on the table before the window. There were peaches. There were also melons, strawberries and creams, rusks, brown trout, piping hot, grilled perch, which were much nicer, chicken deviled enough to burn one's hot mouth out, kidneys and mushrooms on toast, fricassee, curry, and a choice of boiling coffee or best chocolate made with cream in large cups. "Have some mustard," said Merlin when they had got to the kidneys. The mustard pot got up and walked over to his plate on thin silver legs that waddled like the owl's. Then it uncurled its handles, and one handle lifted its lid with exaggerated courtesy, while the other helped him to a generous spoonful. "Oh, I love the mustard pot!" cried the wart. "Wherever did you get it?" At this the pot beamed all over its face and began to strut a bit, but Merlin rapped it on the head with a teaspoon so that it sat down and shut up at once. "It's not a bad pot," he said grudgingly, "only it is inclined to give itself airs." The wart was so much impressed by the kindness of the old magician, and particularly by all the lovely things which he possessed, that he hardly liked to ask him personal questions. It seemed politer to sit still and speak when he was spoken to. But Merlin did not speak very much, and when he did speak, it was never in questions, so that the wart had little opportunity for conversation. At last his curiosity got the better of him, and he asked something which had been puzzling him for some time. "Would you mind if I ask you a question?" "It is what I am for," said Merlin sadly. "How did you know to set breakfast for two?" The old gentleman leaned back in his chair and lighted an enormous meerschaum pipe. "Good gracious, he breathes fire," thought the wart, who had never heard of tobacco, before he was ready to reply. Then he looked puzzled, took off his skull cap, 3 mice fell out, and scratched in the middle of his bald head. "Have you ever tried to draw in a looking-glass?" asked Merlin. "I don't think I have," said the wart. "Looking-glass," said the old gentleman, holding out his hand. Immediately there was a tiny lady's vanity glass in his hand. "Not that kind, you fool!" said Merlin angrily. "I want one big enough to shave in." The vanity glass vanished, and in its place there was a shaving mirror about a foot square. Merlin then demanded pencil and paper in quick succession, got an unsharpened pencil and the Morning Post, sent them back, got a fountain pen with no ink in it, and 6 reams of brown paper suitable for parcels, sent them back, flew into a passion in which he said by Our Lady quite often, and ended up with a carbon pencil and some cigarette papers which he said would have to do. He put one of the papers in front of the glass and made 5 dots on it like this. "Now," he said, "I want you to join these 5 dots up to make a W, looking only in the glass." The wart took the pen and tried to do as he was bid, but after a lot of false starts, the letter which he produced was this. "Well, it isn't bad," said Merlin doubtfully, "and in a way it does look a bit like an M." Then he fell into a reverie, stroking his beard, breathing fire, and staring at the paper. "About the breakfast?" asked the wart timidly, after he had waited 5 minutes. "Ah, yes," said Merlin. "How did I know to set breakfast for two? That was why I showed you the looking-glass. Now, ordinary people are born forwards in time, if you understand what I mean, and nearly everything in the world goes forward too. This makes it quite easy for the ordinary people to live, just as it would be easy to join those 5 dots into a W if you were allowed to look at them forwards instead of backwards and inside out. But I unfortunately was born at the wrong end of time, and I have to live backwards from in front while surrounded by a lot of people living forwards from behind. Some people call it having second sight." Merlin stopped talking and looked at the wart in an anxious way. "Have I told you this before?" he inquired suspiciously. "No," said the wart. "We only met about half an hour ago." "So little time to pass as that?" said Merlin, and a big tear ran down to the end of his nose. He wiped it off with his pajama tops and added anxiously, "Am I going to tell it to you again?" "I don't know," said the wart, "unless you haven't finished telling me yet." "You see," said Merlin, "one gets confused with time when it is like that. All one's tenses get muddled up, for one thing. If you know what's going to happen to people and not what has happened to them, it makes it so difficult to prevent it happening if you don't want it to have happened. If you see what I mean, like drawing in a mirror." The wart did not quite see, but he was just going to say that he was sorry for Merlin if these things made him unhappy, when he felt a curious sensation at his ear. "Don't jump," said Merlin, just as he was going to do so, and the wart sat still. Archimedes, who had been standing forgotten on his shoulder all this time, was gently touching himself against him. His beak was right against the lobe of his ear, which its bristles made to tickle, and suddenly a soft, hoarse little voice whispered, "How do you do?" so that it sounded right inside his head. "Oh, Owl!" cried the wart, forgetting about Merlin's troubles instantly. "Look, he has decided to talk to me." The wart gently leaned his head against the soft feathers, and the brown owl, taking the rim of his ears in its beak, quickly nibbled right round it with the smallest nibbles. "I shall call him Archie," exclaimed the wart. "I trust you will do nothing of the sort," cried Merlin instantly, in a stern and angry voice, and the owl withdrew to the farthest corner of his shoulder. "Is it wrong? You might as well call me Wall or Ollie," said the owl sourly, "and have done with it." "Or Bubbles," added the owl in a bitter voice. Merlin took the wart's hand and said kindly, "You are only young and do not understand these things, but you will learn that owls are the politest and most courteous, single-hearted and faithful creatures living. You must never be familiar, rude, or vulgar with them, or make them to look ridiculous. Their mother is Athene, the goddess of wisdom, and though they are often ready to play the buffoon for your amusement, such conduct is a prerogative of the truly wise. No owl can possibly be called Archie." I am sorry, Owl," said the wart. "And I am sorry, boy," said the owl. "I can see that you spoke in ignorance, and I bitterly regret that I should have been so petty as to take offense where none was intended." The owl really did regret it, and looked so remorseful and upset that Merlin had to put on a very cheerful manner and change the conversation. "Well," said he, "now that we have finished breakfast, I think it is high time that we should all three find our way back to Sir Ector." Excuse me a moment, he added as an afterthought, and turning round to the breakfast things, he pointed a knobbly finger at them and said in a stern voice, "Wash up!" At this, all the china and cutlery scrambled down off the table, the cloth emptied the crumbs out of the window, and the napkins folded themselves up. All ran off down the ladder to where Merlin had left the bucket, and there was such a noise and yelling as if a lot of children had been let out of school. Merlin went to the door and shouted, "Mind, nobody is to get broken!" But his voice was entirely drowned in shrill squeals, splashes, and cries of, "My, it is cold! I shan't stay in long! Look out, you'll break me!" Or, "Come on, let's dock the teapot." "Are you really coming all the way home with me?" asked the wart, who could hardly believe the good news. "Why not?" said Merlin. "How else can I be your tutor?" At this, the wart's eyes grew rounder and rounder until they were about as big as the owl's who was sitting on his shoulder, and his face got redder and redder, and a big breath seemed to gather itself beneath his heart. "My!" exclaimed the wart, while his eyes sparkled with excitement at the discovery. "I must have been on a quest." 4. The wart started talking before he was halfway over the drawbridge. "Look who I've brought," he said. "Look, I've been on a quest. I was shot at with 3 arrows. They had black and yellow stripes. The owl is called Archimedes. I saw King Pellinore. This is my tutor, Merlin. I went on a quest for him. He was after the questing beast. I mean, King Pellinore. It was terrible in the forest. Merlin made the plates wash up. Hello, Hob. Look, we have got Collie." Hob just looked at the wart, but so proudly that the wart went quite red. It was such a pleasure to be back home again, with all his friends and everything achieved. Hob said gruffly, "Ah, meester, us shall make an Ostrander of ye yet." He came for Collie, as if he could not keep his hands off them any longer, but he patted the wart too, fondling them both because he was not sure which he was gladder to see back. He took Collie on his own fist, reassuming him like a lame man putting on his accustomed wooden leg after it had been lost. "Merlin caught him," said the wart. "He sent Archimedes to look for him on the way home. Then Archimedes told us that he had been and killed a pigeon and was eating it. He went and frightened him off. After that, Merlin stuck 6 of the tail feathers round the pigeon in a circle and made a loop in a long piece of string to go round the feathers. He tied one end to a stick on the ground, and we went away behind a bush with the other end. He said he wouldn't use magic. He said you couldn't use magic in great arts. Like, it would be unfair to make a great statue by magic. You have to cut it out with a chisel, you see. Then Coley came down to finish the pigeon, and we pulled the string, and the loop slipped over the feathers and caught him round the legs. He was angry, but we gave him the pigeon." Hob made a duty to Merlin, who returned it courteously. They looked upon one another with grave affection and eagerness, knowing each other to be masters of the same trade. When they could be alone together, they could talk and talk, although each was naturally a silent man. Meanwhile, they must wait their time. "Okay," cried the wart, as the latter appeared with their nurse and other delighted welcomers. "Look, I've got a magician for our tutor. He has a mustard pot that walks." "I'm glad you are back," said Kay. "Alas, where did you sleep, Master Art?" exclaimed the nurse. "Look at your clean jerkin, all muddied and torn. Such a turn as you gave us, I really don't know. But look at your poor hair with all them twigs in it. Oh, my own random, wicked little lamb." Sir Ector came bustling out with his greaves on back to front, and kissed the wart on both cheeks. "Well, well, well," he exclaimed moistly. "Here we are again, eh? What the devil have you been doing, eh? Setting the whole household upside down?" But inside him he was proud of the wart for staying out after a hawk, and prouder still to see that he had got it, for all the while Hob held the bird in the air for everybody to see. "Oh, sir," said the wart, "I've been on that quest you said for a tutor, and I have found him. Please, he is this gentleman here, and he is called Merlin. He has got some badgers and hedgehogs and mice and things on this white donkey here, because we couldn't leave them behind to starve. He is a great magician and can make things come out of the air." "Ah, a magician," said Sir Ector, putting on his glasses and looked closely at Merlin. "White magic, I hope?" "Assuredly," said Merlin, who stood patiently among all this throng with his arms folded in his necromantic gown, and Archimedes sitting very stiff and elongated on the top of his head. "Ought to have some testimonials, you know," said Sir Ector doubtfully. "It's usual." "Testimonials," said Merlin, holding out his hand. Instantly there were some heavy tablets in it, signed by Aristotle, a parchment signed by Hecate, and some typewritten duplicates signed by the Master of Trinity, who could not remember having met him. All these gave Merlin an excellent character. "He had him up his sleeve," said Sir Ector wisely. "Can you do anything else?" "Tree," said Merlin. At once there was an enormous mulberry growing in the middle of the courtyard, with its luscious blue fruits ready to patter down. "They do it with mirrors," said Sir Ector. "Snow," said Merlin. "And an umbrella," he added hastily. Before they could turn round, the copper sky of summer had assumed a cold and lowering bronze, while the biggest white flakes that were ever seen were floating about them and settling on the battlements. An inch of snow had fallen before they could speak, and all were trembling with the wintry blast. Sir Ector's nose was blue and had an icicle hanging from the end of it, while all except Merlin had a ledge of snow upon their shoulders. Merlin stood in the middle, holding his umbrella high because of the owl. "It's done by hypnotism," said Sir Ector, with chattering teeth, "like those whalers from the Indies. But that'll do, you know," he added hastily. "That'll do very well. I'm sure you'll make an excellent tutor for teaching these boys." The snow stopped immediately, and the sun came out. "Enough to give a body pneumonia," said the nurse, "or to frighten the elastic commissioners," while Merlin folded up his umbrella and handed it back to the air, which received it. "Imagine the boy doing a quest like that all by himself," exclaimed Sir Ector. "Well, well, well, wonders never cease." "I don't think much of it as a quest," said Kay. "He only went after the hawk after all." "And got the hawk, Master Kay?" said Hob reprovingly. "Oh, well," said Kay, "I bet the old man caught it for him." "Kay," said Merlin, suddenly terrible, "thou wast ever a proud and ill-tongued speaker, and a misfortunate one. Thy sorrow will come from thine own mouth." At this everybody felt uncomfortable, and Kay, instead of flying into his usual passion, hung his head. He was not at all an unpleasant person really, but clever, quick, proud, passionate, and ambitious. He was one of those people who would be neither a follower nor a leader, but only an aspiring heart, impatient in the failing body which imprisoned it. Merlin repented of his rudeness at once. He made a little silver hunting knife come out of the air, which he gave him to put things right. The knob of the handle was made of the skull of a stoat, oiled and polished like ivory, and Kay loved it.